Hello everyone. Today I am here for an interpretation of the poem Ode to the West Wind. This poem is written by P.B. Shelley. Full name is Percy Bysshe Shelley. So before we start reading the poem, we will talk upon some facts regarding Shelley. So he is best known for his classic poems and he was one of the major English romantic poets and regarded as one of the greatest lyric and philosophical poets in the English language. He was radical in his poetry as well as in his political and social views. So radical in his poetry means he was very revolutionary in his thinking. He was a revolutionary poet and he did not believe in the customs and the conventions of the world. So he was the singer of the unborn utopia, and he was little interested in the past, having his eyes fixed intently on the future. So he pours his fiery eloquence against the king, priest, and the state conventions, and all these shackles, they are to be swept away, and a new society without any class distinction and governmental machinery is to be reared upon its ruins. So he was major revolutionary poet, as well as he was a poet of love, poet of beauty, a nature poet, and a lyrical poet. So some of the best known works of Shelley, they include Ozymandias, Ode to West Wind, Skylark, The Mask of Anarchy, The Cenci, Queen Mab, Alastair, The Revolt of Islam, Prometheus Unbound. So these major works you should keep in mind, as well as the major qualities, the major features of his poetry. So as I have told you that he was considered as a radical poet and a revolutionary poet, so his poetry talks about the revolutionary and the radical ideas regarding the political values as well as social views. So he was also considered a poet of love, because it is the power which sheds light upon the tiniest worm and animates it with fire. So he was a love poet, he was the poet of beauty, he was the poet of nature, as he acknowledged the greatness of Wordsworth as a poet of nature, and he wrote some poems under his influence. So but there is a difference between Wordsworth and Shelley in the presentation of nature, because where Wordsworth is a lover of peace and silence and the placidity of the mountains, Shelley delights in the tameless energy of the west wind, which is at once destroyer and the creator. So he's being a romantic poet, it is very obvious that he was poet of nature. He is also considered as a lyric poet because he has written so many beautiful lyrics, and his lyricism is the keynote of his poetry. And in his poetry we find, if you go through very close reading, or if you take a close reading of his poems, you will find all the features or all the qualities of a supreme lyrical poem. So he was a revolutionary poet, poet of love, and a lyrical poet and poet of nature. So this poem, Ode to West Wind, if we start reading the poem Ode to West Wind, so as the title suggests, it's an ode. So it's an ode, and it was composed in 1819. So the poem is in the form of prayer. It is an address. So as it is a ode, in the earlier video I have given you some major literary figures and I have talked upon what is ode. So this ode to west wind, the ode is a kind of address. So this poem is in the form of prayer, and a prayer has three constituents: a deity, a god or goddess to whom the prayer is made. Second one is a supplicant, a person who makes the prayer. And the third is the prayer. So deity here is the west wind, and the supplicant is the poet himself. And for what the prayer is all about? The prayer is for personal redemption and for poetic inspiration. So if we so the poet implores the west wind to listen to his prayer. If we go through the first stanza, we start reading the poem. O wild west wind, thou breath of autumn being, thou from whose unseen presence the leaves dead are driven like ghosts from an enchanter fleeing, yellow and black and pale and hectic red, pestilence trigger multitudes, O thou who charitest to their dark wintry bed the winged seeds, where they lie cold and low, each like a corpse within its grave, until thine azure sister of the spring shall blow her clarion over the dreaming earth and fill, driving sweet birds like flocks to feed in air, with living hues and odors plain and hill. Wild spirit, which art moving everywhere, destroyer and preserver, hear, O hear. Yes, so the poet implores the west wind to listen to his prayer, and he describes the dual power of being the destroyer of the dead leaves as well as the preserver of the seeds that the west wind possesses. So west wind drives the dead leaves over the earth, and this proves to be a great destroyer. She at the same time drives the seeds with her current and buries them under the ground, where they lie dormant throughout the winter. Her sister Zephyr revives these seeds by making them sprout into flowering plants in spring. She is therefore a great preserver. So, this poem, as I told you, that it's an ode and it's in an address to the west wind. So he is making an address to the west wind, and he is describing in the first three stanza the power of west wind. So that he is describing the power of west wind as well as its activities on the earth. So the west wind is described as destroyer as well as preserver, and it sweeps away the dry leaves and preserving the seeds for the regeneration of the earth in spring. If you see the first stanza, first line of the poem, O wild west wind. So here we see the poet is addressing west wind as wild. As I have told you that Shelley perceives nature having tameless energy. He does not see any peaceful or calm aspect in nature like Wordsworth. So he sees or he perceives a tameless energy that nature has, and west wind possesses that very energy. It's very powerful and it's beyond any control. So the west wind appears to Shelley one of the invisible forces of nature, and the poet calls the west wind as the vital essence of the autumn season. So the west wind is invisible. It is invisible, and the invisible west wind is chasing away the dry seeds. So it's chasing away the dry seeds, and In what manner? Just the poet has compared this thing, that just as the magician or magician puts the ghost to flight, just as ghosts are blown away by the wand of an enchanter, the dried up dead leaves of the trees, they are blown away in autumn by the west wind. So the west wind is mighty like an enchanter. It's very powerful, it is mysterious, invisible, just as the spiritual force of the enchanter is invisible. So the dry, dead leaves are yellow and black and pale and dimly red. So their color shows redness of decay and disease. So the dead leaves, which are dimly red and pale, are blown off by the wind, just as crowds of people stuck by some fatal epidemic diseases are driven away from their town by their fear of the epidemic disease. So here in the first stanza, the poet has described the west wind as a powerful and destructive force, and it drives away the summer and it brings storms, chaos and even death. So yet the speaker celebrates west wind and welcomes the destruction that it causes, because it leads to renewal and rebirth. So the west wind is not peaceful or pleasant. It is, the speaker notes that it's the breath of autumn being. If you read the first line, you will know that poet has called west wind as the breath of autumn's being. Autumn is a transitional season, so when summer's abundance begins to fade, so too everywhere the speaker looks the west wind drives away peace and abundance. So the west wind, what does west wind do? So it strips the leaves from the trees, whips up the sky and causes huge storms on the ocean. And in the first section of the poem, the speaker compares the dead leaves west wind blows to ghost and pestilence stricken multitude. So here we have a comparison, simile. In the third line we have simile, as the poet is comparing like ghost from an enchanter. So here we have simile, and in the phrase pestilence stricken multitude we have metaphor. So the clouds in the poem second, so here we see that how west wind is so powerful. So throughout the poem, the speaker praises and celebrates the west wind's power. It is destructive, chaotic, yet this type of destruction is very necessary for the rebirth and renewal. So speaker admires the wind and he wants to take, adopt or absorb the west wind power into his poetry. So in the first stanza, he has talked upon the power of west wind, how it over the earth, and west wind is considered as a destroyer and preserver. So it hints at the poem's theme and begins to establish its form. As you see that speaker begins his poem and he is talking directly to the west wind. So this is an instance of apostrophe. So if you see, you will see that, oh wild west wind. So it's an apostrophe. So the poet, because the speaker addresses the wind not exactly human, so perhaps not even capable of understanding what the speaker is saying. So this is a major problem in the poem. As the poem progresses, the speaker will repeat this gesture addressing the west wind. So he again and again calls thou. So as the speaker does so, he begins the question. So the speaker says a couple of interesting things about the west wind, things that anticipate the poem's broader themes. First, he calls it wild. The west wind seems out of control. It is beyond control. or at least out of human control. It is undomesticated, it is untamed. So there we find an alliteration, wild west wind, and it makes it seem like wildness is essential to the west wind's character. So in the second half of the line, the speaker calls the west wind the breath of autumn's being. So in other words, the west wind is the very essence of autumn, and it's very intimate to it as breath. So autumn is the transitional season when summer's beauty and abundance begin to die out and the bleak winter approaches. So already in this first line, the speaker suggests that the west wind is key to that transition. So here west wind is called breath. So the first line introduces the reader to the poem's form. The poem is written in terza rima. Terza rima is a 3-line stanza whose rhymes lock together. So the first stanza of the poem is rhymed ABA, next is BCB. So terza rima, it was the most famously used by the Italian poet Dante. And this form was very closely linked to him. So Shelley arranges each section of the poem into 14 lines, and each section is in terza rima. So the first line contains a spondi, and he calls it "O Wild West Wind." So throughout the poem, he has discussed, in the first 3 stanza, he has discussed the power of west wind over the earth, ocean and sky. And in the last 2 stanza, he talks and he implores west wind to give him power so that his poetry can be powerful enough to change the whole world. So we will read first stanza only. In the next video, we will go further. I hope you have got the stanza, and please read the second stanza. In the next video, we will take the second one. Thank you.